This talk is about the trees that are used in the Chinese garden. It excludes the trees that are used in the surrounding areas, which are really there to integrate the site into the general landscape. Important as these are, their needs are quite different from those inside the garden, as we shall see. Inside the garden, the conditions are special in that they are dominated by the need to provide water for the lake. This water is contained by and extends to these concrete walls. It is contained and prevented from draining away by this impervious film that overlays this granular layer. The medium into which the trees are planted is placed over the top of this, but the water table runs right under this to the walls. Thus, the water table is very close to the soil surface, as little in some cases as 300 millimeters. In order to increase the depth of soil above the water table, the soil was mounded up wherever possible. In some cases, we could reach 600 millimeters of depth. This, of course, was especially important to grow the trees, which would be constrained by the level of the water table. Some species that were selected by the Chinese in the original plan, notably Zelkova fermiana and cinnamomum, were ultimately substituted for willows to cope with this. While this was of some concern back in 2006, after some 6 years the trees are surviving and thriving, so the matter seems to be resolved. The original plant selection from Shanghai arrived in June 2006. The plants are all familiar to us in New Zealand. As you can see, there were 22 species and the total number of plants numbered 55. 3 of these, the cinnamomum fermiana and the musa, were not considered suitable for Dunedin's climate. However, for cultural reasons, both the banana and the cinnamomum were planted in the garden. We persisted with the banana for a couple of years, but it consistently was ripped to pieces by the wind. The cinnamomums are now stored in the Southern Service courtyard area. Now, here is the original plan showing the distribution of these trees in the garden. As you can see, they are distributed rather evenly throughout the garden, covering all the area. The trees are represented by the black dots with yellow centres. Next follows a sequence of views looking at the locations of each plant in each area. Here the cinnamomum fermiana and lagostromia have gone, but they are replaced by maples and a ginkgo biloba. In this area, the Zelkova is replaced by a willow, the apple with the albizia, and the ginkgo by maples. The fermiana is replaced by a cherry. Here the plants are more or less retained as shown, except that the Prunus armeniaca is replaced by Prunus mumi. Again here the plantings are retained more or less. The main casualty is the musa. And the Acer bergeranum by another willow. Of course, this cinnamomum isn't here, but the others are, except that they're not precisely as located. The apple is there, but not the funeral cypress, while the Acer has been replaced by a cercis. In this location, both the ginkgo and the osmanthus have been relocated, and the musa, of course, abandoned. In this space, all the trees remain as shown. However, it is clear that the space is crowded and some plants should be removed. The next phase of the exercise was the nuts and bolts of sorting, substituting and growing on the plants. Part of that was the matter of providing plants to cover the ground, as the only ground cover suggested by the people in Shanghai was a moss species. Additionally, there was the need to provide suitable plants for the areas outside the garden wall. Here now is the final list of plants that were used in all areas of the garden. They are listed here as herbaceous shrubs and trees, and whether they are inside or outside the garden wall. You'll notice on the list that there's nearly 1,500 herbaceous plants, about 300 shrubs, and 56 trees, all within the garden. Outside the walls there is well over another 1,000 plants. You'll see shortly that there have been many changes to the tree planting in the garden, and further modifications are being considered now. However, much of the original planting is extant, albeit in different places within the garden. What I want to do now is to look at the main areas of the tree planting as they are now, and comment on how they might be modified or maintained in the future. The tree planting in this area is too crowded. In a recent review, it was recommended that the Lagostromia and Cercis be removed, retaining only the prunus. An important function of this area is to provide room for large trees as a major visual element. These are seen as an upper story element that relate the garden to the city and tie it into the surrounding landscape. Pruning these trees is important. The willows need to be tall but not bulky. Rigorous and constant pruning is needed. The maples need to get their heads above the eaves level, but also to reach down to about head height. The important thing is to see through the stems across the lake. So here you see that the maples have been lifted. The willows mark a critical transition point in the garden. They do need to be lifted above the roof line and pruned carefully into an elegant form. The roots also need regular pruning. The rock mountain is the most prominent feature of the garden. The tree planting on this mountain is quite critical in the long term. Many of the species are quite large, and in the European tradition we'll be inclined to allow them to grow to maturity. We are aware of the need to prune these trees to reflect the Chinese tradition. The question is, which tradition? But we're also aware that the mountain is supposed to represent a distant mountain. If this is the case, the question is, should the trees be scaled to reflect this illusion? Here we attempt to indicate what the mountain might look like if we pruned the trees using some traditional Chinese style and maintaining, say, a 50% ultimate tree size. We also indicate a seasonal impression. The Lake Tahoe rock from which the mountain is built is a precious treasure in China. We should never underestimate its importance and value here, or the significance of the mountain to the Chinese who built it. The extent of vegetative cover of the rock then becomes significant in terms of its representation as a distant mountain. This, in my view, diminishes the distant mountain effect. If we wish to portray this illusion, the mountain vegetation should be rather sparse and craggy in appearance. In this case, these trees are already too big. They need to be treated as pinjing. The distant mountain effect could appear more like this. Area 13 in the northeastern corner is one of the 4 major planting areas containing important trees. As already noted, the willow needs to be carefully pruned and lifting above the roof line of the pavilions to produce an elegant, graceful and slender tree. It is also one of the most important parts of the garden. It is unique in that it is viewed from at least 6 different viewpoints. From above, you can see that the willow needs to be lifted and how the maples really mediate between the roof line and the ground plantings. Moving through now to Area 17, the third large tree planting area. As with the other 3 large areas of planting, this contains several trees. The willow will form the upper story, while the remainder the median level. But there are 3 genera, which complicates things for landscape clarity: 2 cherries, 2 maples and 1 magnolia. Care is needed to manage all of these. Here is a view of Area 17 from the zigzag bridge. Because there are so many trees here of different types, great care is needed to manage them in such a tight space. I will comment on them separately, but first we'll make a clean slate of it and get rid of all the plants. First up is the maple. There are actually 2 at the moment, and there's only really need for 1. This is planted towards the back of the space. It needs to be pruned to create a sculptured form to fit the space, and also to play against the stonework. Next is the magnolia. This is a very important tree culturally for Shanghai, as it's a symbol of that city. It is shown here as a rounded form, but this needs more thought for the best way to use this plant. Note that the space is tight. Now we have the first of 2 cherries. It is shown here as a subhirtala shape, which can be pruned as a tracery, rather narrow and slender. The second cherry is planiform and broad. Since this is planted towards the front, it can overhang the water. Finally, the willow. This needs to be brought above the rest of the plants, but rigorously pruned for both form and size. The roots also need to be rigorously pruned. This is intended to demonstrate how these trees can be fitted into this area, but it very much depends upon considering the form of each tree and the space that one expects them to occupy. They need to express themselves properly, but they cannot be made to sit on top of each other. The willows and maples in this 4th area need the same treatment as the rest. The lower level of planting needs some reorganization, and this shows how we wish to deal with it. Such things as the strong articulation of shrub plantings, the glimpse through the maple branches, and the simplification of ground cover are important. All of this improves the readability of the landscape and gives a sense of greater space. Note the ginkgo in its new home needs to be lifted above the eaves line. And of course the osmanthus, which is really a tree, but treated here as a very large shrub. As can be seen, the tree planting has just passed the establishment stage. There is still the need to consider more carefully the expression of these trees in this garden, to interpret its spiritual intent. In this respect, we are fortunate to retain the advice of Dr. Cao and the experts from the Yuan Garden in Shanghai.